Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine stepping off a wooden dock onto the cobblestone streets of Boston. Not the Boston of gleaming glass towers and rushing commuters, but the Boston of 1775. The air smells of salt water, horse manure, and wood smoke. You can hear the creak of wagon wheels on uneven stone, the bark of a harbor master somewhere in the distance, and beneath it all, a low, simmering tension that you can feel in your chest without quite understanding why. Boston in the 1770s was not a large city by any modern measure. Its population hovered around 16,000 souls, packed into a narrow peninsula jutting into Massachusetts Bay. The streets were rarely wider than two wagons side by side. Buildings leaned toward one another overhead, their upper floors jutting out to squeeze every inch of usable space from a crowded lot. You navigated not by street names, but by landmark, by church steeple, by the smell of a particular tannery, by the sound of a blacksmith's hammer ringing out from a familiar corner. At the center of it all stood Faneuil Hall and the open-air market surrounding it. If you wanted to understand the pulse of Boston, you came here. Merchants laid out dry goods, fresh fish, and imported cloth. Farmers brought produce in from the surrounding countryside. Women in heavy wool skirts moved from stall to stall, squeezing apples, haggling over the price of candles. Children darted between the legs of adults. And everywhere, in every knot of men gathered around a crate or a corner post, there was talk, always talk, about Parliament, about taxes, about whether things were going to get worse before they got better. The people of 1770s Boston were not a simple lot. Wealthy merchants lived in handsome Georgian brick homes on Beacon Hill, their parlors furnished with mahogany chairs imported from London and silver tea sets that had become, ironically, something of a political statement in themselves. These men moved between the world of commerce and the world of politics with practiced ease. They dressed in powdered wigs and fine coats, but their conversations were anything but polished. They were angry men, careful in their anger, but burning with it nonetheless. Below them in the social order came the artisans and tradespeople, the carpenters, blacksmiths, rope makers, and printers who made up the backbone of Boston's working life. These were the men Paul Revere ran with, the men who gathered in taverns like the Green Dragon on Union Street, where the Sons of Liberty held meetings that were not exactly secret and not exactly public. They wore leather aprons and calloused hands like badges of honest labor, and they had their own grievances, not just philosophical ones, but daily, economic, cutting grievances. The taxes on imported goods hit them in ways that the wealthy could absorb, but the working man could not. And then there were those who were so often left out of the story entirely. Enslaved black men and women lived and worked in Boston, in the homes of the prosperous, in the trade shops of the middling sort. Free black Bostonians, too, navigated a city that spoke loudly of liberty while drawing sharp lines around who that liberty was meant for. Crispus Attucks, a man of African and Native American descent, would become the first person killed in what we now call the Boston Massacre in 1770, a death that would echo through the arguments of the coming years. We cannot walk these streets honestly without acknowledging who was walking them alongside the men whose names fill the textbooks. A typical day in Boston began before the sun was fully up. Fires had to be lit, water fetched, animals tended. Breakfast was simple: porridge, bread, perhaps salted fish if you were near the harbor, which in Boston you almost always were. By the time morning light was hitting the church steeples, the streets were already alive. Tradesmen had their shutters open, the smell of fresh bread from the bakeries mixed with the sharp bite of coal smoke from the forges. Apprentices swept stoops and carried messages across the city on foot, weaving through the foot traffic with the ease of long practice. The tavern was the center of social life in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate today. There was no newspaper you could rely on for unfiltered information, no open meeting hall, no coffee house on every corner. The tavern was all of those things at once. Men gathered to drink hard cider and ale, yes, but also to read pamphlets aloud, to argue about the latest pronouncements from London to whisper about what was being planned. Women, meanwhile, held their own form of political life in the home, organizing boycotts of British goods, substituting homespun cloth for imported fabric, brewing their own substitutes for taxed tea. The domestic sphere was not separate from the revolution. It was deeply threaded through it. By the early 1770s, Boston was a city under occupation. British troops had been stationed here since 1768, following the unrest over the Townshend Acts. They drilled on the common. They quarreled with shopkeepers. They drank in the same taverns as the men who despised them. The tension was constant and wore on everyone, not just in grand political terms, but in the small daily humiliations of having armed soldiers on your street corner, watching your cargo, questioning your movements. The Boston Massacre of March 1770 had already scarred the city's memory. 5 colonists dead on King Street, shot by nervous soldiers in a crowd that had been throwing ice and insults before the first shot rang out. Paul Revere's engraving of the scene spread throughout the colonies, inflaming opinions that were already running dangerously hot. By 1773, the city was a coiled spring. The Tea Act, the Tea Party, the intolerable acts passed by Parliament in response. Boston Harbor closed by order of the Crown. The city cut off, punished, made an example of. And through all of it, the people of Boston kept getting up in the morning, lighting their fires, opening their shops, and arguing in their taverns about what came next. What is hardest to convey is the simple human feeling of living through a moment in history before you know it is a moment in history. The people walking Boston's streets in 1773 did not know there would be a revolution. They did not know there would be a United States of America. They knew only that something was wrong, that it had been wrong for years, and that the patience required to keep enduring it was wearing dangerously thin. Some of them wanted independence. Many wanted only fair treatment within the empire they had always considered their own. Some, the Loyalists, whose story is rarely told with sympathy, believed fiercely that reconciliation was both possible and necessary. They were all living in the same city, buying bread from the same bakeries, watching each other from across the street with uncertain eyes. That is the Boston we have been walking through today. Not a monument, not a symbol, a living, breathing, complicated city full of people who were frightened and hopeful and angry and proud all at once, trying to figure out what kind of world they were living in and what kind of world they wanted to build. If you found yourself on these streets in the 1770s, you would not have felt the clean drama of a history textbook. You would have felt the mud under your boots, the cold, salt wind off the harbor, and the very human uncertainty of not knowing how the story ends. That is what makes this era so remarkable to inhabit, even at a distance of 2.5 centuries. These were ordinary people pushed by extraordinary circumstances into decisions that would change everything. Thank you for joining us here on History Reimagined. If this journey through colonial Boston moved you, share it with someone who loves history. Leave us a comment about what surprised you most and subscribe so you don't miss where we walk next. History is not behind us. It is all around us if you know how to look.